By May 1991, the situation at some national universities in Peru had become unsustainable, so much so that President Alberto Fujimori decided to intervene personally. He first did so at the National University of San Marcos. There he was met with marked hostility. Insults and chants broke out, but the presidential security managed to maintain control. A very different scene took place on the campus of the National University of Education Enrique Guzman y Valle, better known as La Cantuta. There, the rejection was massive and much more aggressive. The presidential entourage was surrounded by a student mob that completely overwhelmed the security protocols. They threw projectiles, tomatoes, and stones. One of them hit the president directly in the back. Faced with the danger, the bodyguards had to cover him and evacuate him immediately. He couldn't even enter the university. The next day, in the early morning of May 21, 1991, more than 200 soldiers belonging to the Army Special Forces Division broke into La Cantuta. By 4, during the operation, 56 students were detained, among them Marcelino Rosales Cárdenas, Felipe Flores Chipana, and Armando Amaro Condor, names that would become key to this story in the minutes ahead. I invite you to watch until the end and to subscribe to this channel if you like its content. The military took control of the campus, the buildings, and the university residences. In addition, they permanently stationed a special forces detachment. From that moment on, a curfew was imposed and access was restricted. Students and teachers were registered. No one could enter without showing their university ID. But why did Alberto Fujimori's government make such a drastic decision? What was happening in Peru's national universities in the early 90s? The answer came down to one fundamental reason. Shining Path, led by Augusto Agasta La Torre and Abimael El Guzman, had understood something decisive. This war was being won from the classrooms. That was where the first threads of the organization were woven, and from there much of its expansion was driven. Since 1962, the National University of San Cristobal de Huamanguena and Ayacucho had functioned as a true ideological cradle due to a decisive factor. It was an institution dedicated to training educators. What better vehicle to spread their ideology? What strategy could be more effective for building indoctrination networks? What about instructing those who teach? A few years later, they would be in charge of educating new generations. For that reason, universities like La Cantuta became a top priority target for Shining Path, occupying a strategic place within their plans to capture Lima. With that purpose, the organization infiltrated its cadres into the university and set up inside it the so-called Mariategui Intellectual Working Group, a core group mainly made up of 2 professors, Victor Zavala Cataño and Nilda Atanasio. Both of them came from San Cristobal de Huamanga University. Nilda Atanasio had been one of Abimael Guzman's favorite students in Ayacucho and maintained a close relationship with his wife, Augusta La Torre, Comrade Nora, the number 2 in Sendero. That bond began to form years earlier, when both couples traveled to China to train at Mao Zedong's political and military schools. Abimael went with Augusta, while Nilda traveled with her husband, Professor Hugo Muñoz Sanchez, another one who will prove decisive in this story. Hugo Muñoz taught social sciences at La Cantuta and led political activities on campus. He also wrote the book La Escuela y la Guerra, in which he argued that the educational system should be directly linked to the revolutionary struggle. With that work as his banner, he constantly called on his students to join the armed struggle and embrace the doctrine of that lie called Gonzalo thought. Since the early 1980s, the terrorist group began to consolidate itself in La Cantuta, and by 1989, it already exercised almost absolute control over the university. Groups like Puca and Acta, the FUN, and other student movements progressively lost their members. Most of them ended up joining Shining Path. Even the MRTA was losing ground. Many of its members also went on to swell the ranks of the Shining Path. In other words, the Matacos became secondary Matacos. That's how they were known by university students who didn't belong to any of these organizations. Inside these organizations, however, the MRTA militants identified themselves as Tupas, while those from Shining Path called themselves Lapices. By 1991, Professor Hugo Muñoz Sanchez had already divorced Nilda Atanasio, who decided to leave the country with her children. Tired of the threats and the persecution from the intelligence agencies, Hugo, on the other hand, refused to leave. He remained in La Cantuta, leading the popular intellectual movement, which coexisted with other organizations such as the popular artist movement, whose members performed subversive theatrical plays and sang the Internacional anthem in tribute to Gonzalo Thot. Popular Aid also operated there, along with the Annihilation Squads, armed detachments responsible for carrying out attacks and providing logistical support. In this way, La Cantuta had become one of their main operational bases in Lima. Little by little, the name of that university began to carry a stigma that would mark an entire generation. For a large part of the country, La Cantuta had stopped being just a place of learning. It had become a nest, a true incubator of terrorists, and they weren't wrong. By 1991, La Cantuta was no longer just being used as a propaganda center. Shining Path had taken control of the study committee, students from the cafeteria, the university residence, transportation, and cultural activities. The deans and rectors avoided openly confronting the organization. They ceded space, provided resources, and allowed its expansion. That's why, on the morning of May 21, 1991, Alberto Fujimori decided to personally inspect the National University of Education Enrique Guzman y Ibaye. But he was prevented from doing so. So the next day, he ordered the military to intervene on campus. Terrorist graffiti was erased, and dozens of students were arrested. Professor Hugo Muñoz did everything he could to get them released. He put their families in contact with human rights organizations to ensure they received legal assistance. And he used his institutional authority to certify the regular student status of many of the detained kids. Innocent young people, victims of a misunderstanding, had nothing to do with the terrorist activities they were accused of. In this way, he gradually disproved the accusations that the authorities used to justify their detention. The university had come under the control of the Army's Special Forces. But that didn't mean terrorism had been eradicated. After all, they were used to operating in secret, in silence, from the shadows. In the midst of that atmosphere appeared Rosa Pretel, an administrative worker at the university. She was a supervisor in the women's dormitory who, tired of the damage the terrorists were causing to the institution and hopeful that the military forces would manage to expel them for good, she gave the army information about Shining Path members staying in the university dormitories and the places where they were hiding their weapons. Her collaboration soon reached the ears of Shining Path, making her one of... On September 4, 1991, 3 terrorists got out of a yellow Volkswagen and shot her as she was next to her body. They left a note with a single message: snitch. Rosa Pretel would not be the only one to lose her life for standing up to them. Another of the murders that most shocked public opinion at the time was that of Franklin Tabaragayo. Franklin, a history teacher at La Cantuta and mayoral candidate for Chaclacayo, was a strong critic of Sendero's presence and ideological control on the Cesar campus. During his classes, he openly questioned them. That was enough to make him a target of the terrorist organization. One morning, while he was taking his young daughter to Miguel Grau School in Chaclacayo, he was ambushed and shot to death right at the entrance of the institution. These crimes were not isolated incidents or exceptional excesses. They were part of a strategy. During those years, Shining Path was not only trying to convince, but to subjugate. See, their logic of terror was based on the systematic elimination of any form of dissent. For the organization, there were no shades of gray. Anyone who opposed them and their revolution had to disappear. To make way for the construction of a new world, everything was justified as long as it contributed to that purpose. That's why they felt neither sorrow nor pity. They did not hesitate to kill, because through the perspective imposed by indoctrination, murdering innocent people was not a crime, simply an unavoidable cost, a part of the process as natural as it was inevitable. This level of violence and social dehumanization had reached the universities, and from there it spread like a virus that was hard to contain. Faced with this increasingly critical situation, the government of Alberto Fujimori decided that the armed forces had to act on all fronts, including those that could only be fought from the shadows. The strategy consisted of fighting terrorism from there, using their own methods, their philosophy, their own rules. The Colina group had been created precisely for that purpose, and it was already fully operational 3 months before the beginning of this story, in November 1901. In November 1991, the operation in Barrios Altos had been considered a resounding success, and much of that result was attributed to an efficient strategy, the Abadia Infiltration. The agent who managed to slip in and survive inside the Barrios Altos compound, which was full of terrorists he was able to identify. From that moment on, infiltrators became key assets for the Army's intelligence service and the Colina group. And coincidentally, at La Cantuta, they had one who had been living among the students for years. His name was Jose Tena Jacinto, and since 1986, he had been posing as just another student in the Faculty of Technology, specializing in civil constructions. Jose lived in the university residence, observing everything, listening, gathering information, and studying so as not to raise suspicion. Anyway, Jose Tena was considered an undercover agent, not an embedded agent. That is, he had not joined the ranks of Shining Path like Agent Abadia had. Jose was not part of the operational teams. His job consisted of conducting external surveillance, identifying which students took on the most radical leadership roles, who led the political activities, in which houses they met, and how many of them spent the night in each dormitory. He gathered information continuously without needing to join the organization, and since mid-1991, all those reports would be sent directly to Santiago Martin Rivas, the head of the Colina group. But on July 12, 1992, something happened that changed everything and almost ended in tragedy. The infiltration was close to being exposed. It all began when Sergeant Victor Manuel Hinojosa, under orders from Martin Rivas, entered La Cantuta disguised as a student. His mission was to take panoramic photographs of the campus and its facilities. However, while he was recording the pavilions, he was spotted by a group of students who immediately became suspicious of him. They intercepted him, questioned him, and when they found out he didn't belong to the university, they started beating him. Among the attackers was Bertilia Lozano Torres, another name we will come back to later. In the midst of the beating and desperation, Hinojosa shouted with all his might, "I'm here to see Jose Tena. He's my cousin." Tena was in a nearby classroom when he was alerted that his supposed cousin was being attacked. He quickly went downstairs without knowing what was happening, and seeing Hinojosa restrained and beaten, intervened right away. "He's my cousin," he shouted. Then he took the film roll and tore it up in front of everyone to calm them down and dispel some of the suspicion. The maneuver only worked partially. The beating stopped, but the distrust increased. From that moment on, the infiltration was considered extremely dangerous, so much so that Tena had to flee, leave the university residence forever, and move to a nearby house. Sleeping on campus was no longer a safe option. Some of the most dangerous people in the country were beginning to suspect that he was an infiltrator, and everyone knew exactly what fate Shining Path reserved for its enemies. Tena left, but he managed to keep his network of informants inside the university intact, and he was going to need it, because just 4 days later, on July 16, 1992 at 9:20 at night, one of the most devastating and memorable attacks by Shining Path in Lima took place. The bombing on Tarata Street, right in the heart of Miraflores. That night, a car bomb loaded with more than 40 kilos of dynamite destroyed buildings, homes, and vehicles. 25 people lost their lives, and more than 150 were injured in an act of terror that shocked the entire country. Of course, that's another complex and painful story that we will tell in detail on this channel very soon, but it's essential to mention it now, since that tragedy would be the trigger for this story. The morning after the attack in Tarata, Jose Tena Jacinto received reports from his network of informants at La Cantuta. According to the information transmitted, around 11 at night, several students identified as Shining Path members entered visibly agitated, some even injured. Others assured him that the vehicle used, that is, the car bomb, had been seen hours earlier at the university. Tena immediately reported this to his superiors. The information went through the CIN, then through the CIE, and finally reached Santiago Martin Rivas. The next day, on July 17th at 6:30 in the afternoon, the head of the Colina group sent a message via pager summoning Piesca, a key operative in the organization. Group leaders at Barranco Municipal Park in 30 minutes. The first to arrive were Jesus Sosa Saavedra and Federico Navarro, who relayed the first instructions to Sosa. Boss has ordered the capture of the Cantuta kids who did the Tarata job. What do we do with the detainees? Sosa asked. They are to be interrogated and sent to Daireote. The order is to capture, Colonel Navarro replied. Shortly after Santiago Martin Rivas appeared, Navarro handed him a printed list with the names of the students who were to be apprehended. It had been prepared with intelligence information gathered by the CIA. It was time to go in. The infiltrator Jose Tena had confirmed through his network of informants that night a meeting of Shining Path militants would take place under the guise of a birthday celebration, supposedly to celebrate the success of the attack on Tarata Street. We have work in La Cantuta. We'll take the Ramiro Priale route and go pick up your people, ordered Martin Rivas. There was something strange about his demeanor. That night, he seemed nervous, agitated. As the hours passed, they would discover that he was under the influence of alcohol. He had spent hours drinking beer at the Danubio, a bar and restaurant in Barranco. No one really understood why. At 7:30 in the evening at Plaza San Martin in front of the Cinemetro, Jesus Sosa Saavedra met with the infiltrator Jose Tena Giacinto, who would play a key role in the reconnaissance phase. As the minutes passed, the other members of the Colina group joined in, and once they were all together, they headed to the La Pólvora barracks in El Agustino to finalize the details of the operation. During the trip, the Volkswagen carrying Martin Rivas joined them, and it seemed he was still drinking. When they arrived at the barracks, the agents cleared up their doubts. He had drunk more than he should have and seemed nervous and irritable. After briefly coordinating, they set off for Cosica, heading to the eastern part of Lima, where their final destination, the Enrique Guzman Huivale National University of Education, was located. They took the Ramiro Priale highway, and at kilometer 23, Martin Rivas ordered the vehicles to stop. There he assigned roles. The assault group would be led by Supo. The security group would be under Sosa's command, while the cover and arrest group would be led by Pretel and Chucky. At that moment, Jesus Sosa said, "Major, I understand that we are going to make arrests. We brought sugar cane and shovels because Colonel Navarro said it wasn't an arrest operation, it was an elimination mission." Martin Rivas exploded. "Damn it, I'm in charge here, not Colonel Navarro." The agents fell silent. Sosa just agreed with him, and the convoy resumed its march. Along the way, they had to pick up Professor Octavio Mejia Martel, Dean of the Faculty of Sciences and a mathematics teacher who was very close to Professor Hugo Muñoz. Mejia had agreed to help identify the people who would be detained. When they finally arrived at the entrance of La Cantuta, and it was past midnight, vehicles stopped in the darkness, and everyone waited attentively for the final signal. The tension inside the vans was palpable, especially because the group still wasn't completely clear about what the mission was. Apparently, they would have to improvise as they went along. It wouldn't be the first time that had happened. However, this time the operation was different. It had been organized hastily and with uncertainty, with much less planning than the previous ones. The only ones to get out of the vehicles were Martin Rivas and Lieutenant Aquilino Portela. The latter quickly drew a sketch to remind Rivas of the location of the male student residence, the female residence, and the faculty building. Then Portela went to the security booth to arrange for the entry of the trucks. La Cantuta had been under military control for over a year. The head of that base was Lieutenant Velarde Astete, who ultimately authorized the entry of the squad. The vehicles moved forward, led by Martin Rivas's Volkswagen, in which Lieutenant Aquilino Portela and Professor Octavio Mejia were traveling, heading directly to the men's residence. Behind them, the three pickup trucks advanced slowly, a white Mitsubishi L200 pickup and two red Jeep Cherokees, the same ones they had used just 8 months earlier to travel to the Barrios Altos estate. In one of them was Jose Tena, the CIA infiltrator, the undercover student who had lived there for 6 years, in the very place they were about to enter. As they moved toward the pavilions, Martin Rivas gave him a direct order. "Right now, write down the list of terrorists you identified." Tena began to write 6 names. Among them, the professor's name stood out. Professor Hugo Muñoz Sanchez, the burly man with a beard and mustache, whose true role was an open secret. This was not just a simple social sciences professor. He was a veteran Shining Path cadre. His loyalty went back many years before the organization even had that name, and he had left Guanta with a specific mission to bring indoctrination to the capital. In the classrooms and hallways of La Cantuta, everyone knew it. The popular intellectual movement he led was nothing more than a front to achieve that purpose. On Tena's list, there was also another name that would be crossed out hours later: Bertilia Lozano Torres, for the intelligence services. That student was a priority target. His name had been reported on more than one occasion. At La Cantuta, many people linked her to the terrorists, and she was also the same person who just 5 days earlier had participated in the attack against Victor Manuel Hinojosa's agent, an episode that the Colina group remembered very well. For them, between the two lists, they had the printed one prepared by military intelligence and the handwritten one made by the undercover agent. There were at least some of the direct perpetrators of the July 16th attack on Tarata Street. Everything seemed to indicate that the plan had been conceived in that place. With that conviction, they burst violently into Barones' residence. Leading the group was Agent Pretel, ironically nicknamed Chiquito because of his imposing size. With a kick, he opened the door that had been blocked with a piece of furniture. Apparently, the students suspected what could happen. They woke up confused. Some instinctively tried to hide. Others remained motionless. As the students stood paralyzed with fear, Martin Rivas gave a curt order. "Say your name." The students responded terrified while he checked both lists. At his side, Octavio Mejia, the Dean of the Faculty of Sciences, confirmed or ruled out their identities. Those who matched were immediately separated, taken from the dormitories and violently restrained. There were 7 in total. Armando Amaro Condor, 25 years old Luis Ortiz Perea, 21 Felipe Flores Chipana, 25 Heraclides Pablo Mesa, 28 Juan Gabriel Mariños Figueroa, 32 Robert Edgar Teodoro Espinosa, and Marcelino Máximo Rosales Cárdenas, 28. Some tried to protest, shout, or ask questions, but they were silenced with blows. While that was happening, Chiquito Pretel was already kicking open another door. This time, it was the women's residence, and the noise woke everyone up. The procedure was repeated. One by one, they said their names while Martin Rivas checked them against his lists. Finally, 3 women were separated from the rest. Bertila Lozano Torres, 21 years old, Dora Olave Fierro, also 21, and Norma Espinosa Ochoa. Of the 3, only Norma began to cry and scream desperately. She insisted that she had no connection with the others, that it was all a mistake. Her panic attack caught the attention of the agents, but it wasn't until she got into the truck that Jose Tena Jacinto intervened. "Get the dark-skinned girl out, damn it. You've made a mistake. She's not the one." Then Norma Espinosa was taken out of the truck and set free. While this was happening, a group of 3 agents led by Aquilino Portela separated from the rest and moved stealthily toward Professor Hugo Muñoz's house. They knocked on the door and called him by name. Muñoz came out confused. He was only wearing black pants and was barefoot. He was subdued immediately, and when they searched the room, the agents found a letter of allegiance to Shining Path, a document in which he expressed his absolute loyalty to the party and its leader, Abimael Guzman. Hinal. They covered his face and took him to where the detained students were already piled up in the trucks, which remained running by the exit, waiting for the arrival of the final piece. Once everyone was there, they left La Cantuta and took the Ramiro Priale highway again, heading back. The detainees were hooded, surrounded by armed men. Everything suggested that the next stop would be Incot, but Martin Rivas had other plans. He took the radio and communicated with technician Julio Chucky, who was driving the white Mitsubishi at the end of the convoy. "Chucky, we need to pull over." His tone was dry and authoritative. The group stopped by the side of the road in the darkness. Chucky got out of his vehicle and walked toward Martin Rivas' car. They talked in the dark. The voices grew louder without reaching a consensus. Seconds later, the agent returned visibly upset. The plans had changed. He relayed the new order from the boss. They had to follow him. That night, Martin Rivas was unrecognizable. He seemed erratic, irritable, impulsive, contradictory, as if he were fighting an internal battle that seemed to say, "Take them to Incot? For what? So they can be released like so many times before." It's impossible to know for sure what was going through his mind, but everything indicates that for him, that possibility was unacceptable, not only because he abhorred that impunity, but also because it went against the purpose of the group he led. They weren't created to take alleged terrorists to Incot. That was never the plan. So he wasn't going to do it. It was very hard for him, but deep down, the decision had already been made. Suddenly, in the middle of the route, the phone rang. It was a call that Martin Rivas was hoping not to receive. On the other end of the line was General Nicolás de Bari Hermosa Rios, the army's commanding general, to repeat the order. Those detainees must go to Incot. Rivas had already made a decision. But that was too direct an order to openly disobey. So he chose to lie. That herd is already with St. Peter, my general. Then he hung up, and there was no turning back. The fate of the captives was sealed. Jesus Sosa Saavedra suggested going to a police shooting range, a place he considered ideal for carrying out the operation. When they arrived, it was around 4 in the morning. Martin Rivas got out of the vehicle and ordered his men to check that there was no one around. The darkness was absolute. The silence was deathly. But it was about to be broken. Because inside the vans, the 10 detainees had lost their patience. Hooded and not understanding the delay, they began to complain and insult. One of them shouted a defiant chant, "Long live the party, damn it." Up until that moment, everyone still believed they were on their way to Dinkot. It was the usual procedure, many already knew it, and that's why they didn't feel afraid. But time kept passing, and they were still in the trucks. Suddenly, the 9 students and the professor were abruptly taken out of the vehicles and pushed toward the shooting range. There, they were forced to kneel on the ground, with their faces covered and their hands tied. "They don't scare us," one of them managed to shout. An officer approached him and confronted him. At that moment, Professor Hugo Munoz intervened. "Don't say anything to that soldier. Don't be afraid, boys. Tomorrow we'll be out." One of the officers immediately hit him with the butt of his weapon. "Shut up. Do you think we're police officers?" The tension became unbearable. That confrontation ended up enraging the members of the Colina group, completely dispelling any hesitation. After that, no one had any doubt about what had to happen. Martin Rivas gave the final order. Chiquito Pretel and Chucky Aguirre started shooting at the students. Rivas also opened fire on them. Meanwhile, Jesus Sosa Saavedra was in charge of executing Professor Hugo Munoz. Everything was over in a matter of seconds. With the executions done, the agents began to dig hurriedly. They needed to make the bodies disappear before dawn. The ground was hard. Time was short, and the risk of being discovered increased with every minute. Finally, they buried the bodies in a makeshift precarious grave. They got into the trucks and returned to Lima as if nothing had happened. But the calm would not last long. Hours later, on that same July 18, 1992, Martin Rivas began to worry about one thing. The graves had been poorly covered, very poorly. He couldn't get that thought out of his head. He was convinced that sooner or later someone would discover the bodies. So he ordered Sosa to return to the shooting range to inspect the place. When he arrived, the situation was obvious. He immediately called Martin Rivas to give him the bad news. His fears had been confirmed. "Major, everything is visible. There's an arm and a hand sticking out. You can also see the clothes of another body. The operation had been poorly done, and time was running out." Rivas immediately ordered part of the detachment to return and redo the burial. They dug again at the foot of a hill in a less visible area. They covered the bodies with more dirt and left the place. Everything seemed resolved. But the uneasiness still haunted Martin Rivas. While all this was happening, at La Cantuta, students and professors were publicly denouncing the disappearance of 9 students and a teacher. Rumors began to multiply. Some began to talk about what they had seen that early morning, the trucks, the armed men, and the chaos that had erupted inside the campus. But who were the captors? Who were the disappeared? For many, the conclusion was obvious. Among the disappeared were people linked to the Shining Path groups that had dominated the university for years. In the following days, many terrorists stopped attending classes. Some left the campus. Others simply disappeared. Rumors of what had really happened soon left La Cantuta and quickly spread throughout the rest of the public universities, bringing with them a growing sense of fear among the militants. The infiltrators deployed all agreed in their reports. Political activity had decreased abruptly. Apparently, fear had begun to take hold among those who used to spread it. The mission seemed to have produced the desired effect. But for Martin Rivas, nothing was right, nothing was resolved. His concern had turned into an obsession that only grew as the hours passed. 3 nights after the operation, he came to a conclusion. A definitive one. The graves would be discovered. So, he made a new decision. The bodies had to be exhumed and made to disappear forever. On July 20th, the Colina group returned to the shooting range, not to make people disappear this time, but to erase the traces of that crime. First, they burned part of the remains. Afterwards, they loaded what was left into the trucks. The new destination would be the Chavilca Ravine in Cieneguilla at kilometer 14. There, the darkness was overwhelming, as absolute as it was that night. But there was a big difference. This time, someone was watching them. His name was Justo Arizapana Vicente, a recycler who was sleeping nearby while watching over the plastics he collected. He was awakened by the noise of the vehicles. He felt afraid, but his curiosity got the better of him. He walked slowly to a higher area, and from there he saw them. It was Martin Rivas, Carlos Pichilingue, and 8 other people working in the middle of the night. The shovels hit the ground again and again. They worked for more than 2 hours without stopping. The bodies were distributed in 3 mass graves, 2 with 3 bodies and 1 with 4. They covered them well, then they left. And so, the restlessness that had haunted Martin Rivas for days finally seemed to leave him. But it didn't disappear. That night it found a new host. Justo Arizapana couldn't sleep. He stayed awake, shocked by what he had just witnessed. He waited for dawn. Then he approached the place. First, he threw some stones onto the ground, fearing they might have left explosives. When he saw that wasn't the case, he started digging the ground with his hands. He found cardboard, then ashes, then burned bones, sneakers, remains of clothing, until he finally understood what was in front of him. "They're dead," he said to himself. The discovery by Justo Arizapana Vicente would become one of the most decisive elements in clarifying the case. His testimony paved the way for one of the most important judicial processes in Peru's that discovery. It's possible that the chain of command, which until then had remained hidden and unreachable, could never have been reconstructed with the same degree of certainty. It's not unreasonable to think that, if it hadn't been for Justo Arizapana, Alberto Fujimori, Vladimiro Montesinos, and other links in that long chain that began with the agents of the Colina group, probably never would have been convicted. At least not for the La Cantuta and Barrios Altos cases. However, despite having been such an important person during the investigations, and despite the numerous promises he received from those who most needed his testimony at that moment, Justo would end up facing an extremely sad fate, one that no one would want to face. What happened to the humble recycler who held the most powerful men of Peru in the 1990s accountable? How did his life unfold after his testimony? It's a very interesting story that's already available in the members section. If you enjoy the content on this channel and would like to support the project, I invite you to join our member community. There you'll find the cruel fate of Justo Arizapana, the man who discovered the Colina Group's mass graves, as well as many other exclusive stories, like that of Alejandro Toledo, and how did he negotiate with the MRTA for his release from the Japanese ambassador's residence, his obsession with Jacqueline Beltran, the story of Susana Iguchi, and many more. Your support makes it possible for us to keep investigating and producing new stories like this one. If you're enjoying it, I also invite you to like and subscribe. The first person Justo told about what he had seen was his friend Guillermo Catacora, and in June 1993, both of them drew a sketch indicating the exact location of the clandestine graves. Guillermo gave that map to the journalist Juan Jara Berrospi from Radio Comas, but the news was never published. The journalist was intercepted by the police and accused of terrorism, and shortly after, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. He would end up serving 11 years. The truth had been silenced, but not for long. Months later, a new map ended up in the hands of the opposition Congressman Roger Cáceres. He was investigating the possible involvement of army members in the La Cantuta case. Inside the envelope he opened, there was not only a sketch, there was also a fragment of charred bone, apparently part of a human hip. Roger Cáceres handed the material over to C Magazine, and in the early morning of July 8, 1993, a team of journalists led by Ricardo Ucera arrived at the Chavilca Ravine. They began to dig. The remains were still there. Almost a year after being buried, they were coming back to the surface. Hours later, Torcubas Villanueva arrived at the site accompanied by a team of forensic specialists. They began the official excavations. The evidence was irrefutable. The La Cantuta massacre was finally beginning to come to light. At the end of 1993, the DNA tests were sent to England. They confirmed that the remains found in the Chavilca Ravine to the missing victims of La Cantuta. For their families, the path to the truth and final closure would be much longer. In fact, 5 of the 9 students were only buried in 2023, 31 years after their disappearance. What happened in the early morning of July 18, 1992? It was undoubtedly a massacre perpetrated by a paramilitary group, the Colina Group, an event that, because of its brutality and because of the involvement of state structures in its execution and cover-up, it ended up becoming one of the most serious and significant episodes of human rights violations in the recent history of Latin America. But the consequences did not come immediately. In 1995, the Fujimori government protected those responsible through amnesty laws, thus fulfilling the promise he had made to them years earlier. However, the fall of the regime completely changed the situation. Those who had been protected until then ended up facing justice. In 2009, Alberto Fujimori, he was sentenced to 25 years in prison as an indirect perpetrator in the Barrios Altos and La Cantuta massacres. His former advisor, Vladimiro Montesinos, would receive the same maximum sentence. The former army commander-in-chief, Nicolás de Bari Hermosa Rios, the former head of the National Intelligence Service, Julio Salazar Monroe, and the leaders of the Colina Group, Santiago Martin Rivas and Carlos Pichilingue, the other members of the chain of command, also received sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years in prison. The court determined that the Colina Group was an organized criminal structure financed and protected by the state, created to carry out a systematic policy of selective elimination of people considered innocent by the courts, law-abiding citizens, unarmed, unconnected to any subversive activity. Their executions were classified as crimes against humanity. Those rulings dismantled the official version that for years portrayed the victims as terrorists, forcing the Peruvian state to acknowledge its international responsibility and to grant millions in compensation to the families of these innocent people whose fundamental rights was in the cruelest way. That was what the courts and international organizations dedicated to protecting human rights established. That was the truth established by the courts. But the uncomfortable question this documentary raises is whether that is really the truth. Based on what I've investigated, I'll tell you what I think. For years, we have been taught to view the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as the definitive narrative, the most complete reconstruction of what its authors called the internal armed conflict. For many Peruvians, it is the most important reference about that period of our history. However, I think that rigor requires us to ask whether a report prepared in such a polarized political context can be considered a definitive reconstruction. Since its publication, various researchers, jurists, and analysts have questioned many of its methods, conclusions, and interpretations. For many, that report is an incomplete truth, a biased version, one-sided and shaped by political interests. Even so, the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is still, for many, the easiest explanation to accept. For others, the most convenient. But this channel has never been about simple answers. After comparing testimonies, judicial files, audiovisual archives, books, and other historical records, which I will leave in the description, I can say that the story you just saw is the one I consider closest to what really happened. There may be some inaccuracies, since it's impossible to reconstruct such a dark past with complete accuracy. But in essence, these were the facts. This is not hidden information. It's there for anyone who doesn't want to settle for what a single document says or with a single version of this story. But the truly difficult part begins now. Because the conclusion that emerges from this truth, it's deeply complex. On one hand, it's true that the Colina Group operated as a paramilitary and clandestine structure that carried out a systematic policy of elimination, responsible for real massacres. But it's incorrect to claim that their operations were carried out outside of any intelligence work. There is evidence dismissed in the judicial processes that shows direct links between most of the people present in Barrios Altos and La Cantuta and Shining Path. They were terrorists, but it's not possible to say that all of them were shown. The death of an 8-year-old child is enough to prove it irrefutably. Just as we analyzed in the previous story, this duality of truths coexists in the same event. It creates a great contradiction. A mix of emotions that makes this chapter one of the most complex episodes to analyze. Maybe the challenge is no longer about knowing what the truth is, but in deciding which one we make our own. Were they terrorists or innocent? Was it necessary to eliminate them like that? What other options did the Peruvian state have? 35 years later, would you say the right decision was made? There are questions that will remain unanswered, but there's one I'd like to ask more directly. If you had had the power to decide, what would you have done? I'd love to read your answer and opinion about this topic in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this story. See you in the next one. Goodbye.